Taylor, Dean of the Party School. Delighted to have you all with us. We are, usually we do these Beyond the Headlines panels. They're mostly in-house kind of operations, but today we're privileged to be joined by two colleagues from across ComAv, from the School of Communications. And one is, to my immediate right, is Joan Donovan, who's Assistant Professor of Journalism and Emerging Media Studies in the College of Communications. And she's the founder of the Critical Internet Studies Institute, a nonprofit that develops cutting-edge research and educational programs in advancing public knowledge, emerging technologies. And she's as many of you know, a whistleblower and who blew the whistle on corporate influence over research at Harvard Kennedy School and joined BU shortly after. And she's known for research on disinformation. And to my immediate right is Dr. Michelle Emazine, who's the Associate Dean of Research and Comm and an Associate Professor in the Department of Mass Communication, Advertising, and Public Relations, and also serves as Director of the Communication Research Center at BU. Her research focuses on mediated persuasion and misinformation, so two important topics today. And then the farthest over is our party's own Quinn Slobodian, Professor of International History at Party. Professor Slobodian's been on the faculty just a year now, but has already made a tremendous impact, and has been, many of you know him, so I won't elaborate on his enormous...
They're mostly my students, try.
Yeah, but he's also been commenting on in various media outlets recently on the subject that preoccupies us today, which is the role of private actors, in particular, one in particular, who's had outsized influence on government in recent days. If you've read any of the social media or traditional media recently, you're very familiar with the role that Elon Musk and his team of Northeastern students has been playing in basically interfering with the function of government and the role of a private actor in government and interfering with congressional appropriation money that's already been appropriated. The U.S. aid is set to shut down tomorrow. They're closing offices and people are returning home. I just got off a call talking about the impacts of much of that on democracy and governance assistance, on healthcare assistance and everything else, and all of this stems from this sort of Doge operation and the interference in monies that were already appropriated in various U.S. government agencies. So he's operating with the apparent consent of the president, but the Times said just 2 days ago, the rapid moves by Musk represent, quote, an extraordinary flexing of power by the private individual. So that's the conversation I think we want to talk about today. So I want to ask all of my colleagues here on the panel, what's different about this? What distinguishes, if we want to, private actors, oligarchs, if you want to use that term, like Musk, from past powerful business figures. The U.S. history in particular, and certainly global history, is littered with examples of wealthy private actors intervening in, sometimes interfering in public policy decision making. But what's different about Elon Musk, the current era, and how should policymakers and the media and the public respond to this outsized role? So why don't I start with you?
So, in a word, I can say what's different is media. The media environment distinguishes this moment in time from historically, when we had other powerful business people, the Rockefellers, Henry Ford, Carnegie. Few of them had significant stakes in media properties. There were a few important, influential business people who did have stakes in media properties. Steve Jobs, Pixar. Bill Gates founded a company called Corbis Corp in 1989 that provided digital media content. He no longer owns that. And then, of course, is Warren Buffett, who had a stake in newspapers, which I believe is much smaller. I think he currently only owns Business Wire, which is a press release distribution company. And then, of course, another influential business person that has a media empire is Rupert Murdoch, who has wielded those media properties very much to serve his political ideology and his business interests, although he, maybe belatedly, there have been some moments where he has been held to account. As in the UK with the News of the World scandal, the News of the World is now defunct, and more recently Fox News settled a defamation lawsuit with Dominion Voting Systems for $787.5 million for election fraud claims. But I would say that Musk, who only owns one media property, Twitter, now X, he has tremendous influence with that media property. And I think some of that influence is due to the legalities of Section 230, which we can get into, but basically protects online service providers from liability for third-party content. And I guess I'll end this train of thought with a quote from 100 years ago. The media, new media of the day was radio. And the government, Congress, was very concerned about the power of radio at that point in time. And they were debating about the Radio Act, which would be implemented in 1927. And Representative Luther Johnson from Texas, during this debate, stated the following: American thought and American politics will be largely at the mercy of those who operate these stations, for publicity is the most powerful weapon that can be wielded in a republic. And when such a weapon is placed in the hands of one person, or a single selfish group is permitted to either tacitly or otherwise acquire ownership or dominate these broadcasting stations throughout the country, then woe be to those who dare to differ with them. It will be impossible to compete with them in reaching the ears of the American people. And I put forward that today this is what's happening with Elon Musk and X.
Joan?
Very powerful. So I wrote a book, co-authored a book called Meme Wars about the impact of internet culture on politics. It's the first book that looks at the internet and the development of the internet and internet design and memes through the perspective of the right wing. And so it starts with Occupy, but not with, your basket of unwieldy anarchists, but instead with Alex Jones and Ron Paul and what was happening at the time on right-wing internet. Because people didn't understand, well, why are people in Occupy saying things like end the Fed, right? That was Ron Paul's influence. And Ron Paul was one of the very first politicians to know and understand the power of online organizing. So he had a first mover advantage. And many of us in the public had a first mover advantage in terms of how we got on social media. We brought in all of our friends. Everything was free. And you could say and do and organize any way that you felt, or any way that the tool would allow. And for the most part, there wasn't a lot of what we call friction between what you post and what people saw. It was pretty much a 1-to-1 ratio. You post something, it's in the timeline, 12 seconds later. What changes over the last 14, 15 years with the internet is that these tech oligarchs figured out that they built a political tool. They built political weapons. And they now exercise control universally over what information you see, when you see it, how often you see that information, and if you see fact checks or error correction, right? We're kind of like living through this moment now where the people who built and invented and worked very hard not to allow those tools to become public. You know, there was this big debate, and it sounds quaint now to think about thinking about social media as common carrier. What would it mean to have social media operate like the telephone, right? Like the telephone isn't allowed, telephone companies aren't allowed to put advertising in between you and grandma, right? And so there are rules about privacy, about, you know, your ability to access and have free communication, which is completely upended by the way in which what were once entrepreneurs or startups in the tech space have now become essentially the governors of speech, right? So you have to throw the notion of free speech out the window when you think about social media, because it doesn't really operate like that, especially social media that utilizes algorithms to interfere with the flow of communication that you have subscribed to, right? And that's why platforms like Blue Sky, which now feel really innovative, are actually just dupes of what we had back in 2010 and 2011, which was unalgorithmic, you know, unmediated communication. Why Musk matters is Musk understood at the very moment when Dorsey, Jack Dorsey, was thinking about disconnecting from the world, right? Dorsey was going to just go kind of live on his own private island and you know, not wear shoes and enjoy his day. He didn't like being
grow a very long beard.
Grow a very long beard and you know, become a philosopher king. And he didn't want to be called in front of Congress. He didn't want to be held to account for running an enormous telecoms company that was in many ways disruptive to the free flow of communication. Musk knew it was a weapon, but he knew in particular that Twitter was different, and it's different for precisely the reasons that Michelle was outlining, which is that's where the journalists were. That's where the activists were. That's where the left had centered its communication apparatus. And so buying it and turning it essentially into 4chan, which some of you will know, and the ones of you that don't know what 4chan is, or Pepe the Frog, yeah, I wish I knew what your world was like. But 4chan is sort of the like dark underbelly of what internet culture really is, which is very noxious, polluted, viciously violent. But it became this place where lots of wayward youth and people from my generation, of Gen X even, will go to that place because it's kind of an everything for anyone shop. And of course, it gives rise to different kinds of social organizations. So out of 4chan, you get movements like Anonymous, the positive version that's written about in B.L. Coleman's book on hacker, hoaxer, whistleblower, spy. And then you also get the negative version of it, which is the creation of online mobs that go and dox people, try to convince trans people to kill themselves, publish and distribute child porn. This is why like that weirdo QAnon movement was so obsessed with saving the children, is they were being fed bits of information that was only coming through an anonymous message board that was in the context of the circulation of unfettered and unmitigated child pornography. So child pornography is real to you when you're being exposed to it in the moment where you think you're discovering forbidden knowledge. And so this moment with Musk is very particularly about him buying and cashing in on a communications platform that both destroyed the networks that journalists had spent many years building, and then also created a new social organization for the online far right. And what was interesting this morning, I'll just give you one anecdote and hand it over to Quinn, who will dazzle us, I'm sure. I woke up this morning to see a fact check from Russia Today. And the fact check from Russia Today was, you don't need to believe this story about USAID giving 20 million to Angelina Jolie and 4 million to Ben Stiller to go shake hands with Zelensky. That didn't happen, that's fake news. but USAID is bad, right? So the point of it was to say USAID is bad, but now we have Russia Today, like an actual organization designed to disrupt democracies across the world, dunking on us. Because Elon Musk is tweeting that, you know, USAID is wasting money in all of these different ways, right? So you have now X is a purely political weapon propaganda machine that is feeding a frenzy of people who likely are going to go after anyone, especially people in positions of moderate bureaucratic power, university professors, people who call them out on their BS, doctors who practice gender-affirming care, anyone with diversity, equity, or inclusion in their job title or job description, right? That anti-DEI stuff is just white identity politics. Don't be fooled by it. Don't be cowed by it. And expressly do not allow you as a student, especially at a university like Boston University, which is a private university, to change your behaviors, right? Because none of that applies to you. But we are fighting a war in which it's going to be increasingly harder and harder for us to pay attention to one thing, and that's because they're utilizing a strategy of flooding. Bannon came up with this, but it's been around for years. You fill the zone with shit. You just give them so much you can't handle it, and the next thing you do, what do? You turn on Netflix. They're like, I'm gonna get out of this brain space and watch a cool movie. But that's my take on Musk right now.
Thank you.
Great. And I should also mention that Professor Kaya Shilda, also from the Pardee School, was supposed to be here, but she got the flu that had been bouncing around her family this morning, so she couldn't. But she works on European politics, and many of you are in my far-right Europe class. So I wanted to answer Scott's question, but also say a little bit about kind of a European perspective, and I'm sure that will come up later. I mean, from the European perspective, looking at the US, it's indeed, as Scott just said, it's from a European perspective, the United States has always been a place kind of governed by the rich, for the rich. It's a place of millionaires and billionaires kind of writing laws. So like, what exactly makes this version of that different from previous versions? And I think it's a good question to start with. The Gilded Age robber barons have already been invoked, the kind of Carnegies and the Rockefellers. And if you ask yourself, you know, how did that class of plutocrats in the late 19th century enrich themselves, then, you know, they didn't have to do the kind of activist techniques that Musk and his fellow billionaires are doing now, because there was a kind of what historians would call elite closure. So the people who were on the boards of JP Morgan and Rockefeller were also the people who were the presidents of Harvard, were also the people who were, you know, the Supreme Court, were also the people who were running the US government. So there was an extremely small stratum of society that already had a pretty large share of the, you know, the gross domestic product and wealth of the United States. So there was no need to sort of fight a war, a class war from above, so to speak, to, you know, get what you saw as your fair share. Into the 20th century, especially with the New Deal, you know, power relations start to transform in this country. The New Deal was actually a transformative attempt to redistribute wealth in ways through infrastructure, social programs, extremely high taxation of the incomes of the super wealthy. In the 19th century, there was no income tax, full stop. By the end of Roosevelt's time in office, it was above 90%, I think, the top marginal rate that a very wealthy person had to pay from their income tax. So there was a class war being carried out in more real ways. There was now, from the point of view of the very wealthy, they were being, you know, attacked and potentially expropriated by a newly empowered, you know, mass democracy. So they needed new tactics. You could no longer just rely on the fact that you married into the rich family that lived down the street, you know, from you in Back Bay or the Upper West Side. And so into the post-war era, you got new forms of influence. The creation of think tanks like Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, in some cases the Brookings, or not Brookings Institution, the American Enterprise Institute. You had new forms of lobbying. You had, of course, forms of campaign finance and donations, ways of currying favor with lawmakers to influence them either directly or indirectly to legislate in your favor. So this was basically the start from the 1950s to the 2010s. If you asked yourself, how did the super wealthy protect their privileges when they were under assault? Well, they had these forms of, funding forms of civil society and lobbying that pushed lawmakers towards their interests rather than ones that might be more redistributive. What's distinctive to me and crazy about the current moment, I agree that it does have something to do with media, but it also has to do with this willingness to directly participate in the act of governance. I mean, think about it. It's a bit odd that we've never had a business person or an entrepreneur as a president in the United States, even though you think it's the land of entrepreneurs, the land of business. Why? There was a kind of division of labor. The lawyers and other people took the role of government, and the business people, were the stewards of the economy, and they worked together in some form of harmony. The fact that someone like Musk, Ramaswamy, or David Sachs is willing to put aside their very time-consuming and profitable roles as the CEOs of often as many as 6 companies to do the really kind of mundane and unrewarding task of government is a qualitative shift in the form of influence. So there's a direct activism that is going on here. And the fact that almost immediately, Elon Musk gets impatient, and rather than as Max Weber famously described government as the slow boring of hard wood or hard boards. Not something that Musk has ever been interested in. He does have something called the Boring Company, but it's for driving tunnels through Las Vegas for his electric vehicles. The fact that he gets immediately impatient and starts going in and basically effectively tearing out the wiring of the federal government shows us the consequences of trying to take the skills of the startup entrepreneur and transfer them directly into the space of the state, the government. It works different. So I think that is, to me, the really striking difference is this willingness to be hands-on, to push lawmakers aside, to push the Constitution aside, even though all of these things have been working tremendously in their favor for decades. I mean, the number of billionaires has grown like this in the last 20 years through Democratic administrations, Republican administrations. The tax code favors them ever more. The state already is their servant, effectively. So it really makes you ask the question, like, why take these risks? Why stick their neck out?
And can I make one point about the fragility of technical infrastructures? There used to be jokes amongst Twitter employees that if you change the code base, the lights might go off, right? These are not, especially the government systems, are not even coded in modern coding languages. They're in this language called COBOL, which is arcane. It's even your ATMs, when you go and you get your money out of your ATMs, that's being run on like Windows NT, which is like before Windows 95. So that infrastructure is old. And the reason why DOGE is able to do this, the Department of Government Efficiency, it's because they renamed USDS. So the executive order for the US Digital Services that Trump made was to remake this very small agency that was founded under Obama. And this USDS's role was to bring in technical experts who would examine the code base, not the data in the systems, right? Very different things, right? One thing is about the architecture, like imagine a library. One thing is about looking at how the shelves of the library are constructed. Data would be the books on the shelves, right? And those things are bifurcated for a reason, because the personal information that is data is actually protected by a privacy law from 1974. So that's one of our most modern privacy laws. We don't really have any new ones to speak of, but the infrastructure itself is incredibly fragile. And so the fact that they're able to go in with both read access and write access means a few things. One is that they're most likely downloading and expropriating the data and then putting it into other systems, most likely AI, which we don't know what AI is built on, but that's a secret sauce, right? That's the recipe for something that we're not allowed to know about. And And that you have these very experienced engineers that actually don't, you have these very young engineers that don't have the experience with legacy systems that many people who've been doing computer science and engineering for the last 20 years would already have. So in a basic technical environment, if you want to deploy any code changes, you would isolate the system, you would test those code changes, and then you would see how the system reacts. None of that is happening, right? And so we are looking at a catastrophic, critical failure of infrastructure if these kind of things are allowed to continue. Musk sees DC as the operating system of the US government. And so it's important for him to be there and to expropriate the data literally personally in some instances. And then once he's able to build a totalizing system, there will be nobody left at the White House. There's probably nobody in the world capable of auditing and understanding what those systems are doing, because ultimately nobody's keeping track. Nobody's tracking changes, right? And so, but these systems are very fragile. And so it's already affected some NSF postdocs who haven't been able to get their paychecks because once changes were made, it's hard to walk them back. So you got to be very careful, you know, to understand not the legality, but also the technical parts of this are completely opaque to us. We have no idea what's happening under the hood there. And it could very well be that they're writing software, like most malware does, that deletes itself once it does its, you know, whatever the task is that it was meant to do. And it could take us decades to figure out what those changes are.
So this is literally, we are witnessing the dismantling of our governmental institutions.
Well, it's an insurrection, but bloodless.
Well, it's good. I mean, again, some have called it a coup.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Some have used the
Y'all
term.
would probably know better than I know what a coup is.
Well, and the recent reporting is talking about the notion of state capture, and which we've seen, you know, most famously recently in South Africa as a formal takeover of the state apparatus by private actors. But I want to, you know, so we'll turn it over to the audience in a second. I just wanted to have Quinn just double down on one last point. Of U.S. presidents, at least in terms of business people. I mean, the fact that Musk is a private citizen, unappointed through any official processes, unelected, unvetted by the traditional appointments to the executive branch, and yet. And this also comes back to his role in X and social media, but his influence in society as this oligopolist. I mean, you know, and as this, we have 6 companies or whatever. I've got a few: X, Tesla, SpaceX, the Board,
Neuralink.
So Starlink, yeah. I mean, it's pervasive. But
Neuralink is my favorite.
Our society, I mean, much of the society, has conferred a legitimacy upon him. Like, this is a successful businessman. He can actually bring, that was a selling point during the campaign. I'm going to appoint Elon Musk as the head of this new Department of Government Efficiency because he's such a successful businessman, putting aside the fact that the market value of Twitter was halved under his direction. But nonetheless, so I wonder if just what the whole, the public has, or much of the public has said, yeah, it's fine with us.
Yeah.
It's this guy, you know, he knows what he's doing, so we should elect him.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say a couple things about that. One, I was reminded recently, and I posted about this, that Obama at some point reflected in 2016 that maybe after office he would go to Silicon Valley and become a venture capitalist because it was so attractive to him, this combination of money, the future, innovation, the private sector. So the fact that someone who, at least if you ask someone abstractly who's the kind of opposite of Trump in recent years as a president, you say, well, probably Obama's with you, right? That might be an average liberal or democratic response. And yet, the kind of hubris and self-importance that Silicon Valley leaders operate with was granted to them by, again, successive administrations, and probably Democrats more than Republicans. I mean, Clinton really doubled down on the digital economy. Gore was hugely into that stuff. Obama certainly was looking to Silicon Valley to solve all of America's social and economic problems as well. So indeed, like, these people are, monsters of the mainstream. I mean, they're people who we made ourselves collectively. I think that another thing, just to make sure that some Europe gets in here, that we see that is unique, is how willing Musk in particular is to jump into partisan politics in the European Union. So the fact that he's not only willing to just come down four square with one party or another, which would already be unprecedented. You don't have Bezos or Zuckerberg sort of standing up to support the Labour Party in the UK or the Social Democratic Party in Denmark. Musk is both willing to intervene in this way that's traditionally been taboo for private actors, but also, of course, to line up with people who many people consider far-right parties, which constitutionally in Germany you're allowed to refer to as far-right because there are so many people who are extremists who don't believe in parliamentary democracy within their ranks. So his sort of brazenness in flaunting those taboos also represents, I think, a kind of a new border that has been crossed in normal conduct of politics.
So I want to ask our two communications scholars about methods to combat this, especially given Musk's control of the major social media platforms and the tentacles that he has into the communications and media space, and how sort of everyday citizens, not to mention, the Congress, might resist some of this encroachment on what has heretofore been quite boring bureaucratic processes. But can I just let that kind of germinate maybe, because I think students will be interested perhaps in asking similar questions. So if we may, we can just open it up and see what they say. But I was just thinking about sort of methods of resistance, if I can, that's not a very popular word these days, but of the sort of like both citizens and politicians to this, what is kind of a flood the zone, as you said, Joan, this takeover of not just the media space, but because you can control the narrative so much, what does that mean? What are the implications for counter narratives and resistance? But anyway, why don't we open it up to you all if you have some questions, and we can just go from there. This is the state of the country at the moment.
I mean, I could ask a question of these
okay,
two, and then if it maybe sparks any thoughts. I mean, because you referred to, much was made a moment ago about Twitter/now X, and you referred to it as the dominant social media platform, but it's not, right?
Correct.
Not even close.
Correct, like a quarter
it's
of...
dwarfed by
Yes.
Instagram, it's
Yes.
dwarfed by Facebook.
Oh, sure, yeah. Okay.
It's dwarfed by TikTok.
Yeah,
Daily
but
average users are actually very small.
I hesitate on that because just the raw numbers about daily active users, we cannot avoid Musk's missives, right? Because they move from Twitter very quickly to mainstream media, they're copy and pasted, they're screenshotted, so they kind of, talk about spreading the trauma around. Like, go to therapy, deal with your issues. But how can one man be everywhere? And this was very similar to what happened with Trump in 2016. But to answer your question about what people can do, I think there's two things immediately. So one of the things that keeps me sane in a world that feels crazy is music. So Public Enemy gave us two very good pieces of advice. One is, don't believe the hype. Literally don't. And keep that refrain in your head of don't believe the hype. Don't believe the hype about ChatGPT. Don't believe anyone that pretends to have knowledge with no sourcing, right? And this goes for anything that you see online. Suspect it immediately. Be like, this doesn't seem right, this doesn't feel right, this doesn't look right, how would I know? And if they're not telling you how they know, it's literally rhetoric, it's propaganda. It's part of pushing you further and further away from seeking truth and justice. The other thing Public Enemy taught us, fight the power. You have to fight the power. You cannot sit in your room and bed rot and think, woe is me, I'm never gonna get ahead in life, I'm never gonna know what to do, I'm in college, is this degree even gonna be worth it? Are we even gonna vote in 2025? You have to be an active participant in the world. You have to be an active participant in your education. Choose projects that matter. When you're given the option in class to go and study the thing that you care about, use that to develop your voice and develop your intellect and to really think about, what am I going to be as a person in a world like this? We're living like genocide in our time. Trump is saying he is going to go and move people out of Gaza. And we have a media that's saying things like, this is outlandish, this sounds
Audacious.
audacious, right?
Audacious.
We have other words for that that felt like a compromise at the time. Calling things ethnic cleansing was a compromise for not calling it genocide, right? And so we are on the cusp of US going into a major world war. It's one thing to deliver weapons and somebody else drops the bombs. It's another thing to deliver troops and do that expropriation yourself. And as citizens, you have a ton of power to call, to show up, to be present, to organize. You don't have to agitate the university. You can organize within the university. You can see your fellow classmates as people who are going to be resources and helpful to you over the course of your entire life. I have friends that I met in undergrad that I still organize with. And that's because once you find your community, that's when you find yourself, that's when you find your voice, and that's when you find the tools to resist.
So building off of that, I have to say, I think the reason I haven't lost my mind yet in this political environment is that I'm so focused on my research and helping to do what I feel contributes to what's happening at this time. So it's, I don't know, I feel like I'm doing something with my skills to help in this moment.
Give the example of the fact checkers. It was a brilliant project right at the right time.
Yeah, so January 7th, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Meta would be abandoning its fact-checking program, its third-party fact-checking program. And that program was, Meta partnered with International Fact-Checking Network approved fact-checking organizations from around the globe that would verify content that was on Meta. Instagram, Facebook. Now, what was misunderstood was that Meta would pre-select the claims for these fact checkers to check. So it wasn't a perfect system because studies have shown that what they were being asked to check tended to be less political and it was more just entertainment value, viral stuff. But anyway, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Meta would be abandoning that and moving towards the system that Elon Musk had implemented at X called Community Notes, where users on the platform would verify the accuracy, or try to verify the accuracy of content and leave a note and debate with each other. And I guess after a certain number of votes in agreement on a topic, then it would be accessible to users. So I wrote about this, and I went into the field shortly after January 7th and polled the United States adults. One of Mark Zuckerberg's claims was that most people don't want fact-checking. People aren't into it. And so I polled US adults and found that over 2/3 of people were said that they did think that there should be content moderation on social media platforms.
This was your own poll?
Yes. It was done by Ipsos, so it was nationally representative. And not only that, we asked them specifically about the fact checkers, relying on fact checkers. And close to 2/3 of people across party lines were supportive of that. They were significantly less supportive of the community notes model. So, and further, the community notes has been much less effective. I mean, we see it's not effective on X, there's just so much.
Well, if Russia Today is fact-checking
Yes.
X, then Elon
But
Musk.
so Zuckerberg's rationale for doing this is just capitulation to curry
Yes,
favor with the
absolutely,
administration.
absolutely, I think you
Yeah.
wrote about
And
that.
Yeah.
It's cheaper.
It's-
Yeah, and so kind of circling back to bringing in Europe, I think one issue that I'm interested in monitoring is the EU has their Digital Services Act and also, yeah, that has to do with disinformation. It's linked, they have a policy that's linked with misinformation and social media platforms, some responsibilities that they need to implement if they want to operate in the EU. They're the backstop here, and I'm interested to see whether they're going to do anything to.
I think they'll get steamrolled by Musk.
You
I mean,
think?
oh yeah, no, I think when Trump rolls out the EU tariffs, it's going to be one of the things, like if you don't want this to be bad, then you can make things more easy for my buddies, Musk and Zuckerberg, and roll back content moderation,
Well,
roll
JD
back
Vance
GDPR.
also came out and said that, that the US would defend against any international, or against any other country legislating US companies,
Mhm.
right? And that's why you see these companies that used to really celebrate their internationalism and their global, reach, doubling down on, like, it's convenient to be American today, right? Because tech is now a piece of foreign relations, right? And so the best way to get other countries to not pass laws that would protect their citizens against this technology is to have the might and the power and the purse of the US government protecting you, right? And so that's part of Zuckerberg's big shift here. If you haven't seen The Social Network, tomorrow's Friday, I got no job, I got shit to do. Watch it. It's a very interesting distillation of the early ideas that got us here. And one of the things that drove, and I teach this in my disinformation in the press course, is that one of the early things that drove the participatory internet and this idea of social media is misogyny, right? Zuckerberg wanted to create Hot or Not, or this website where you could rate people very quickly if they were hot or not and get on to the next picture. He made a version of that featuring women featuring his Harvard female classmates, right? That's the first version of Facebook. YouTube was supposed to be a dating site because engineers were very lonely, and they thought, well, if people are doing VHS dating and DVD dating, maybe, uploading a clip of you on YouTube could also, engender some more action. And so even the entire US system that we've built around cloud services has a lot to do with wanting more and more unique and novel pornography, right? So some of the first people that made any money on the internet were people who figured out how to put naked pictures online, right? And so when we ignore the origins of the technocracy and where this all comes from, we end up with systems like this that are designed especially to make money with the least amount of friction as possible. So all of your social media systems right now, the ones that are most popular, are little more than advertising infrastructure. You're allowed to post, but your post is the exact same thing as, the Thistle food box or whatever, the vacuum cleaner. TikTok is uniquely different because that is a peer-to-peer app that turns you into the salesperson. So you're not just getting ads, but you yourself are being asked to create those ads and be have these sponsorships and creator ships. And so as you think about your own social media use, think about it with a bit of a critical mindset. You know, what is it asking me to do? Who is it putting me in touch with? What is it asking me to buy? The same kind of criticality that you would bring to, you know, the television shows that you watch or the other kinds of media that you enjoy. Because technology tends to appear to us as magic. It tends to appear to us as completely self-serving. Many people in this room are from Gen Z, maybe a little bit older. Like, this is the generation that raised you as, you know, the main character, right? It's unfortunate, like you are the star of your own social world. But you don't actually know who all else is looking, right? And that's important here, because you're putting things out into the world, and you don't know 10 years from now if that's going to be useful to an adversary at your job, if that's going to be useful to an ex that you do not want contact with anymore, right? And so those systems are built and designed specifically for advertising and nothing less. But our participation in those systems is feeling more and more like a chore. I think that's the last thing I'll say, is that I grew up not having to perform in front of a camera and text on the internet all day long about what I'm doing and what I'm eating and who I'm talking to. I'm not recording my transactions on Venmo about, you know, who I shared a cup of coffee with. All of these digital traces are starting to add up to a fuller picture. And unfortunately, we have very little control about what happens to those digital traces once we put them online. And so it's incumbent upon us, I think this generation in particular, not just Gen Z, but millennials and Gen X, that we advocate for serious privacy legislation.
Can I just say one more small thing based on, I think it's a really good point that Joe made about sort of tech companies' self-interest now becoming part of the foreign economic policy of the United States. And vis-a-vis Europe, especially, there's one really nice discrete example of this, which is Musk has a close relationship with Giorgia Meloni, the current president of the Prime Minister of Italy, and he has been talking to her about providing satellite internet services for the Italian armed forces through his own product, which is called Starlink. At the same time, the EU has been trying to build up their own homemade alternative to Starlink called Iris, and the assumption had been that all of the other European member states would simply take as default that they would wait for Iris before rolling out a new satellite service. But now, Musk has been able to sort of peel off a defector in the form of Meloni, and it's not hard to imagine that the next phase with the rollout of tariff threats will be to compel European nations now to go with the Musk option instead of try to develop their own kind of made in Europe.
I mean, is it, you know, you think about this in the context of democracy and the implications for democracy, right? I mean, not just here at home, in terms of, again, a private actor acting in this way and controlling these critical spaces that have heretofore been part of the public sector, but in terms of like the influence that you all are suggesting over European, you know, privacy laws and fact-checking and everything else, that what I'm hearing is that you think the Europeans are likely to cave, whereas at the same time, Musk is influencing Trump's positioning on China and more authoritarian states, and so and maybe not coming down as hard on China as Trump had expressed during the campaign, and that might be his inclination otherwise. So it's 10% tariffs. Only 10%, right? It's this nefarious influence, but it also has, it seems to me, deep implications for not only the practice of democracy, but for global democracies and who is empowered and who is elevated in this new reality.
There's a question up front.
Yeah, it was kind of on that topic of the EU privacy laws. I mean, we've seen in the past that when Facebook tried to, I think this was like late 2010s, Facebook tried to make the user information more public, and the EU pushed back a lot, and they actually threatened to ban Facebook before it was even Meta there. And this went along with like WhatsApp too. I think it was right after the buyout. So I don't necessarily see it as the EU will cave on this, but I think it'll cause a lot of tension, so I just wasn't sure if that was something that you guys considered or what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, if the EU is not willing to really stand up foursquare against the annexation of Greenland, right? I mean, there's been no...
We're gonna buy it.
Maybe, all I mean is we are in a different space. The willingness to overstep
That this
conventions
is a discussion that
quantum
actually
leap.
gets.
What's that?
Yeah.
No, that this is a discussion that actually gets any errors.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was the
Klobuchar
moment, that, like, you know, the opposition parliamentarian in the Danish parliament had a like fiery for a Dane, I guess, speech about how this is outrageous. But then the next conversation was like radio silence. So the EU wasn't coming out, you know, united saying never. NATO wasn't saying anything. So I think things that you could imagine that you would have a fighting chance on before, even the previous competition commissioner was frequently like sparring with Musk openly on X until recently, and that's not happening now. I think that the willingness to just weaponize trade policy is in another, it's just in another sort of stage now. You might be right, but I just wonder what, if you get down to full just like pound for pound, who has the leverage and what can the EU do to push back against the United States in such a situation? You hear the most ridiculous things, you know, like tariffs on Harley Davidsons, Kentucky bourbon, California wines, like the French are buying a lot of those anyway. It's always been, since 1945, a massively asymmetrical relationship across the Atlantic. The EU and European countries have always been fighting with, you know, sticks against bazookas, but for different reasons it was in America's interest to extend the security umbrella, bring European countries into the transatlantic market, into the world economy. But there was always the possibility that they could change their mind. And what it looks like to me now is they're just saying, that deal's off.
In media studies, we do look at silence. So I wrote a paper about, well, recently there was actually a tweet where people were like, US aid is weaponizing strategic silence, which is a concept that I brought to the fore in studies of disinfo, because it turns out in the 60s and 70s, when journalists were starting to realize that the KKK were manipulating them into writing stories that were favorable to white supremacists, journalists, photojournalists would go to KKK rallies. They'd be assigned to go, but they'd forget to bring their camera, right? So journalists started to come up with this concept of strategic silence, and when, you know, instead of putting a cross burning on the front page of the news, what would it be to reduce the column inches to, you know, just a negligible blur? And so studying silence, what you learn is that only politicians are one of them. But when politicians are silent, especially on issues like this, you have to bristle a little bit as a scholar, because what they're not saying is also that they're not in solidarity, or that they're not going to guard against. I mean, it was very clear to me after the press conference with Trump and Netanyahu that it was a very clear call to action from the global community, right? So you have activists run into the breach and say this is preposterous. You have other, you know, oppositional parties in the U.S., like the Democrats, saying this is outrageous. But what you don't have are world leaders really coming out in droves and saying, we will not allow this to happen, which is different from saying it's preposterous, it's absurd. And so these are the things to look out for as we move into an authoritarian, or what I'm calling a techno-fascist state, which is that when people are afraid to use certain words, when they're afraid to say things that normally they would have said 2 weeks ago in public, that is saying and doing something not just to the individual psyche, but to the collective consciousness that we all share. Governance is about being able to reach in and change the behavior of an individual, but also be able to see the collective at the same time. And what data from the internet allows you to do is have those 2 points of view. And I used to believe that the only thing that really kept social media away from becoming a tool, a direct tool of the state, was that tech CEOs really fashioned themselves as wanting to be tech companies and like on the vanguard. But now you have the guy who discovered Roblox tweeting just yesterday, I don't know if anybody saw it, we built the modern world. Why shouldn't we be allowed to run it?
I didn't know that was the Roblox.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is like, so this is not just an ideology or an ethos shared by the billionaires that run the inauguration dais that also paid what I would consider like cash bribes to the inauguration fund to show their alignment with Trump. But it extends beyond and into all other pieces and places in which we might put our data, we might put our children even.
I could pick up on your theme of silence. Another thing we're seeing, another institution that could possibly be resisting or pushing back is the media, the institution of journalism.
Or universities.
And of course, specific to the media, I mean, that's been in the throes of being dismantled, right?
Well, I thought that's where you were going when you were talking about the difference of tech oligarchs and media. I could have mentioned Bezos owning the Washington Post. The fact that, you know, the spaces in which you could theoretically mobilize against this concentration of power is itself owned by the people who you're trying to mobilize against. Makes it very difficult, not like that. Contradiction.
And so there's very few media outlets that are not part of corporate media. You know, we have PBS and NPR, which, you know, is on the chopping block. And the Intercept, the Guardian.
Democracy Now!
It's Democracy Now! Yeah. But the Guardian's not based in the U.S.
No, it's not, although they do have a U.S. edition.
I've been very impressed with Wired's reporting over the last few weeks, and I think it has to do with the fact that Wired has such deep sourcing in Silicon Valley that they can see around the corner here.
Can I ask you, but what about the distribution? I mean, so you still have these little pockets, but NPR is talking about declining viewership, or
That's a very fair point. So much of the viewership, so much of the dissemination is, you know, on social media, and there's these algorithms that, you know, can downrank things. And that research that I was talking about, the poll about the fact checking, I couldn't get that published anywhere. And I've heard from colleagues at MIT who did similar work. They had the same issues.
Journalists weren't interested.
Trying to put them in as op-eds. It did not get picked up. I'm sorry, what did you say?
Oh, I just said journalists weren't interested. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Oh, we've already covered that.
Yeah. Well, the misinfo, disinfo paradigm is just seen as kind of an old hat now. I mean, not to mention the fact that there's a direct targeting saying we'll pull federal funding from institutions that have misinformation, research centers, so that has a chilling effect, obviously. So.
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. Big plug for whistleblower aid. Yeah, I just want to mention that one of the bright lights and beacons for me is that whistleblowers are coming out in droves right now. I'm on the board of Whistleblower Aid, and we have more potential clients than like lawyers at this point, because people in government, career civil servants do care, and they can't just come out on social media and be like, this is what's happening, because they're not, you don't just lose your job when you blow the whistle. Like, your entire like career comes under the microscope, right? And so a lot of these people are going to have to be way more strategic. They're going to have to, you know, go to lawyers and Whistleblower Aid or other. There's another organization called Signals Foundation that does some of this work, and it's going to be really important that they protect their anonymity as they go through these processes, because it is, you know, it's radically life-altering.
Well, now that you've got Musk and his guys in all of our personal identifiers and everything, it's worrisome about how you even go about that? I mean,
Yeah.
mounting a defense or
Well, this is what's
protecting your own
interesting about,
information.
like the telecom companies, like, I was very thankful that, like, T-Mobile wasn't on the dais, right? But there will come a time, and some of your telecom data is queryable by the government, but there will come a time in which the tides will shift, right? Policy is always about the window, right? Policymakers are always like, we're not at the window. We can't do this policy yet. We don't have the votes. We're not at the window. Protest is about forcing the window open, right? And being very specific about the changes that you want. Black Lives Matter wasn't this amorphous thing that it eventually became. It was targeted at, it essentially came out of stop and frisk, which was this law in New York that was allowing the NYPD to just stop anyone, mostly youth of color, and frisk them and identify them, and it was leading to a lot of abuse. And so you start to see the movement against police brutality grow and grow and grow, and then over time it becomes, and this is a function of propaganda, it becomes weird to say the words, right? You might have felt that in 2016, and now we have this moment where people feel weird to say the words diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what's interesting, like if you take the NSF's example, the National Science Foundation, they now have a list of keywords that they're going through and reviewing grants, and it's like, there's like 50 or 60 words on the list: activist, advocacy, gender, female. The only thing that's not on the list, of course, and this is where silence speaks, is white and male, right?
I thought white was on there.
No, it
No,
wasn't,
okay.
no.
We take the question.
Yeah, so thank you, professors, for speaking today, and Dean. This has been a really depressing talk, I have
Sorry.
and that's okay. So I was born in 2002, which is after 9/11. I was 6 years old in 2008, so I don't remember the financial crisis. I don't remember Occupy Wall Street. I was 13 or 14, I was entering high school when Trump was elected. And so all I've known of this country is instability and horror, So it seems like a fallacy that we have any power as young people. Because in my lifetime, my generation has never actually been able to do something of substance to change any of these decisions that are all being made outside of our control. I realize that the four of you are actually established in your positions, have a soapbox from which to preach and actually impact change. But for those of us who depend on the government, depend on these individuals for our livelihood and are without power, why should we continue to care? Why should we continue to invest our time and our energy in kind of engaging in this negative, this kind of negative cycle, or this negative cycle of information where we're just constantly beating ourselves down? What is the point of continuing to care? And if we continue to care, does that mean we have power? And if so, where can we actually apply it? Because to me, it doesn't seem like we do.
What's your name?
Aiden.
Aiden. Thank you for that question. They say it's darkest before dawn, so I don't want you to leave here, in a negative mindset. There's hope. I just taught at political campaigns prior to this coming here, and my guest speaker was Patrick J. Murphy, who's a former congressman from Pennsylvania, and he was telling my class that he's looking for people your age to get involved with different political action committees, not necessarily engaging in the negative stuff, but just finding something that you can engage in, whether it's related to climate, public affairs. So I think, why should you care? You need to. It's important. We need people like you, all of you sitting in this room, to be engaged, to engage in processes that are true to your values, because it's not hopeless.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, we're in a time of insurgent politics. I mean, it's not as if there's some kind of stasis or like frozen power structures that are not changing. Far from it. I mean, parties that were seen as permanent legacy governing parties in countries like Germany are now being challenged by parties that didn't exist until 10 years ago. Granted, they're from the right, but we'll be reading about a lot of the way that young far-right activists, anyway, are incredibly sort of enheartened and like they feel a great sense of agency actually across the last decade or so, which you could say, well, like, ew, that's not my politics. True, but they're taking advantage of a turbulent media environment, a time where people are searching for alternatives, and they've managed to navigate that for their politics. People on the left, center, whatever, non-aligned progressives have also been able to do so. I mean, 2020 was the biggest street protests in American history, the movement for Black Lives and the George Floyd protests into the streets in numbers that never had existed before. I mean, one doesn't have to, like, haul out poor old Greta Thunberg here, but haul out Greta Thunberg. I mean, she was a young person who spoke in a way that resonated with, people all across the world and helped catalyze climate movements. So I think, even just not a longue durée like historical memory, but even your own consciousness, the pendulum has swung radically from back and forth. So there has been, I would say, moments of mass mobilization and momentum towards politics that maybe you'd find more sympathetic, as well as the ones that we're currently in. So I just think, objectively, we're in a time of great flux, and there's no reason to think that, the outcome is determined in advance. And to think that it's already determined in advance is definitely not a historical perspective. It would be a form of, surrender or copping out, rather than recognizing actually all of the many, many openings that exist, I think.
Yeah, I think for me, the reason why I study society and not politics is because the social is actually very different from organized politics. And we live in a very interesting time for what have now become culture wars. And I've seen a lot of very interesting things happen around culture wars. Like, you look at just the March for Our Lives movement, which, eventually, like, a lot of those activists have fallen out of their activism, but it did have pretty interesting impact on. It used to be illegal to get federal funding to study gun violence, right? There was a law that was passed that said you can't study this, right? So like this mass scourge of violence, and we can't study it, right? So they were able to get incremental policy change by organizing and utilizing society as the buttress that then compels that policy window opening. The other thing is that I study disinformation, but I study disinformation tactics, which is like, what are all the dumb shit they gotta do to convince us that they're successful? So today a friend of mine sent me a link to a Guardian article that's showing that ICE is so ineffective right now because people are doing these Know Your Rights trainings, and they're organizing their neighborhoods, and they're passing out Know Your Rights cards to their neighbors. And this ICE education is actually preventing ICE from arresting as many people as they were arresting per day under Biden, right? And so that education, that community education, ICE was like, shit, how are we gonna win the digital war? They started to update old press releases so that the Google technical system would see them and meme about it. Avoid threats, but post irony, right? Like, some of this shit is so ironic, like Trump taking credit for getting Canada put $1.3 billion into, border security when they actually made that agreement under Biden. Like those kinds of things, they create that that moment or that cognitive dissonance that then allows for us to do more organizing work. The last thing I'll say is that biometric information, right? So when your biometric information is now being sort of hoovered up across the internet, and we don't know what's going to happen with all of that, but part of the future orientation that we should have is that no company should be taking our pictures and turning them into data. So when you play with like character AI or any AI system that has you upload a photo and then it makes you talk, or it makes, you know, whatever photo talk or dance or whatever, that technical system is doing something very specific, akin to creating a genetic profile or a fingerprint. It's taking a map of your face. And that's actually, there's one state that's illegal in, which is Illinois, right? So there's the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois. And when I feel like you, I start calling my Massachusetts state legislator that deals with biometric information privacy, and I try to get them to move it along. So right now the laws just passed through committee, and then it'll eventually come up for a vote. But keeping track of like a pet policy or something that's important to you, and like just trying to nudge against it and organize for it, you'll start to see successes. Like the big fable of history, and I'm sorry to point it out, is that like we write history after the event has passed, right? And it gives and historians have to create a kind of narrative that made sense from the beginning. But when you live in historical times,
I'll keep my mouth zipped about it.
Nothing makes sense. Well, they use archives. There's a lot of method, but there is this like narrative track that comes out of history based on what they include and what they omit, and I count myself among historians, that creates this feeling of cohesive or of non-chaotic narrative, right? But histories, especially in moments like this, it moves very fast and it's very messy, and so it matters what you pay attention to in the long run.
So, I'll just comment quickly on Aiden's question. Just thank you for that. It's a good question. It's an important question. I hope you don't give up hope. I want to echo my colleagues. I hope you find new ways to mobilize. I do think that we are in a different space now, especially for Americans who have not witnessed this kind of total assault on some of our norms and traditions. And so they're going to require novel approaches to respond to, especially when you're talking about control of media, AI, a lot of the very, very new tools that one side has, or all sides have, and so you have to kind of like think about how you're going to mobilize. I find solace. I recently finished Jonathan Ives' book on Martin Luther King, King of Life, and you think about, as King said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I think King was slightly wrong in asserting in that statement that it bends kind of inexorably towards justice. I think it ebbs and flows. But hopefully that in the long haul it will bend in that direction. And if you think about, for example, among many things, the civil rights struggle and what people were willing to put on the line to affect change politically and socially, through concerted effort, through a lot of defeats, through a lot of hardship and personal sacrifice. That's how you get to the outcomes that you're. I assume in your questions.
One more real quick thing. There's a video created by the Department of War back in the early 1940s. It's called "Don't Be a Sucker." If you Google that, "Don't Be a Sucker," it will show you that we've been here before, and lots of parallels to that period of time, but we got through it. So if you're, if you like it, Google "Don't Be a Sucker."
So don't be a sucker, public enemy, fight the power.
King of Life. I mean,
and Jonathan
one thing I was going to say that, I really agree with Joan about like the instrumentalization of overly smooth histories. Is I was thinking about this even before Trump came into office, but Columbia was a place that really celebrated its role as a site of unruly student opinions, and May 68, the occupation of Low Library, is now part of the lore of Columbia. website. It was like, Columbia has a proud tradition of posting like disagree. People just look at their media regardless. And they had this up, as they were literally using the New York Police Department to clear Butler Library of students of an opinion that was opposing that of the administration and the trustees. So this is a moment I think where you can use the dissonance between narratives of history and then principles that are going directly against the narratives of history, sort of ideally, effectively, or impotently, but you can call on them to kind of like call to account people in power.
Yeah, please, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name is Estelle. I'm an undergraduate student in political science. I think I have a hard time understanding exactly what is so surprising about this moment if we look at the US as a liberal democracy, as you mentioned, that has always, like prioritized profit, private actors, business, and considering the weakness of the democratic institutions that are not new, and I think that have been studied, I'm wondering why. I understand that it's threatening and it's foreign, but isn't it just predictable as well?
If you're Karl Marx, yeah.
I think, yeah.
I mean, nobody had stormed the Capitol building in the process of ratifying an election until 4 years ago. And no unelected, advisor to the new government had entered and occupied federal buildings and begun, purging employee roles and getting access to payment systems. This is different than just run-of-the-mill like American corruption or like slap on the back deals between the wealthy and the lawmakers. I mean, those things maybe happen behind the scenes in a way that were totally, mutually beneficial for both sides and maybe, disempower the masses, certainly. But I see a qualitative difference in this level of open disruption and sort of brazenness and unwillingness to even gesture at existing constitutional constraints or guardrails.
It's also a reflection of how much of our system is dependent on norms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we assume that those norms would hold, and they're not holding, right? They can be violated, and apparently, thus far, with impunity. So I don't know if you all want to comment on that question.
I mean, Joe, can I ask you a technical question, Joan? Like when you said, because I don't understand, programming languages, but is the implication that in this attempt to like strip out data from existing databases, they could effectively like erase the entire thing and we would be left with no records?
No records, corrupt records, they could change entries, they're not having to keep account of all of the different things that they're doing. So the reason why bureaucracy is slow and boring a hole under wood is because we've made so many mistakes over time that you can't just go in and start, moving things around in the system and then expect the system to react and work the same every time, especially, something like the payment system at the Treasury. They don't make decisions at the Treasury about who to pay. They cut the checks, right? So imagine if someone at your bank higher up was like, well, Joan has been going online and yelling about how much she doesn't want, to pay this rate at her mortgage. So maybe we just like stop servicing her mortgage and wait till she figures it out, right? That's the other thing. It's like there's not notification when people are accessing your files. We don't know what they might be deleting. We don't know what they're calling for their own personal, either political or business ventures. And typically power works through institutions that have some kind of contradiction between each other, right? So it's in business interest that the government has certain kinds of secrets so that defense contracts with Google aren't publicly available online, right? And so there are reasons why within government there would be secrets and those benefit businesses. And so these are These are very different apparatuses, and when you apply move fast and break things to you know, an early internet, it doesn't affect that many people. But when you apply move fast and break things to the payment processor at the US Treasury, we don't know what we don't know, and we're only going to get glimpses of that catastrophe as it develops. I also worry that we're not developing the technical and core capacity within agencies to be able to deal with this. Musk has talked about this as him, you know, being a Spartan at war with US agencies and departments. Trump seems to validate that point of view. So very rarely do you end up in a position where the executive, as well as the businesses, the institutions of business, universities are silent, media companies are paying off the president, be it Zuckerberg paying $25 million, or CBS going into negotiations, or ABC paying out dividends, or not dividends, but paying out settlements. Like,
We just bought the Melania.
yeah.
film.
Bezos paid $40 million for the Melania film, and so it just is quantitatively and qualitatively different in terms of prediction. Okay, so this is where like my brain gets, you know, I get the red thread out and I am like drawing the lines. My prediction is that Musk is not interested in US imperialism. Musk is interested in a technocratic global order that only he knows how to administrate, and only he can fund, and only he has transparency or a window into. And that is why the march out of, you know, whatever happens in the US is going to get replicated in 3 or 4 other countries very quickly. And then you're going to start to wonder, well, why are we giving him all our consumer data? You know, with these Starlink satellites. T-Mobile just cut a deal to bring Starlink satellites to their systems, right? And so he's going to be in charge of this vast digital empire, and it's invisible to the most of us, right? Infrastructure is somewhat invisible to us, but not to the people who know how important it is for power.
Yeah.
That's a bit dystopic. I apologize.
Well, yeah, bring us on.
Not a question, just a kind of a quick point to go back to like Aiden's kind of thoughts of doom and gloom. I'm sure you guys have all heard that I've spent a lot of time on Reddit, and the people on there kind of come together to create like an archive of all of these government documents to make sure that like if anything is falsified, there's always something to fall back on, and it's publicly available now. I can't confidently say that it's everything that the government has for policies and all of their websites, but it's a significant amount of government archives. So,
Yeah, so the Internet Archive is an incredible resource for. They did this when Trump took office in 2017. There was a hackathon that I was part of at UCLA on January 20th, 2017, because people believed he was going to delete all the EPA data. Like, climate data is really, it sounds dumb, like who cares about what the weather was or what it's going to be. But climate data is a very important frontier for how we think about our relationship to nature, but also it's framed politically as a move towards communism, right? So the reason why they're resisting any science about climate change is because it requires states to cooperate with each other in order to mitigate the effects. The second thing is that these AI data centers are going to take more water and power than the globe provides. And so Sam Altman suggests that, well, once the AI is good enough, it'll fix that problem.
Yeah.
Because if AI can create water, right? And so these are the kind of cynical attitudes that we're dealing with, which is why it's so important to be a scholar these days. Like, it's so important to know how to find facts, wield facts, distribute facts. I mean, this is why the project of the university began in the first place, is to deal with rampant abuses of power. And I know it feels like sometimes feels like a diploma mill or whatever. It feels like you're, just kind of like part part of the soup, right? But I assure you, the more value you put into developing yourself as a scholar and as a student and as an expert on your chosen topic, the more rewarding and effective your career path is gonna be. I come from nowhere, I come from Saugus. Like, I come from the land of like the strip mall, right? You know, but education has been the difference maker in my life, you know, between literally poverty and position, as you had put it.
I think that is an uplifting
Yeah.
note, and that we're out of time. So that's a great place to stop. Thank you all so much for